It's now noon, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar, Designing a Successful Pasture and Grazing System. My name is Lee Bridgman. I'm a program assistant with University of Maryland Extension in Queen Anne's County, and I will be facilitating the session. Throughout this presentation, we will be using the chat pod for questions. Please use the arrow key to select everyone and type your question in, and the presenter will answer your question as soon as they are able. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsors and collaborators listed on the right-hand slide and remind you of our upcoming webinars. On July 22nd, we'll be talking about beef basics, things to consider before starting your small herd. As a reminder, our presentation will be recorded today. An email will be sent directly to you with the link to the archived presentation and any materials presented. Please feel free to share this email with your colleagues. The complete collection of archived webinars can be found on our website at the address listed in blue. And now I would like to turn the presentation over to Amanda, who will be talking about designing a successful pasture and grazing system.
All right. Thank you, Lee, for the introduction and helping with the behind the scenes coordination. And thanks everybody for joining us today. As Lee said, we're here to talk about designing a successful pasture and grazing system. We're going to cover a lot of different components that go into kind of putting pieces together, if you will. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Amanda Grev. I am the forage specialist working with University of Maryland Extension. Relatively new to Maryland. I started roughly a year and a half ago, and I'm excited to be here to talk to you all about this topic today. So with that, there are a few things that we need to think about when we're going about setting up a pasture system. And one of the first is kind of the goals of your goals or your priorities for grazing or for your pasture. And by that, I mean, what are you hoping to accomplish? Are you trying to have your livestock get complete 100% nutrition from grazing or being grass-fed alone? Are you looking to do more of a hybrid sort of feeding some hay as needed, grazing as needed? Or are you using your pastures or your grazing area kind of as more of an exercise area and you aren't quite as concerned with the nutrition that they're getting because they're getting nutrition from elsewhere? These are all very different systems. I would say that most farms probably fall into the hybrid feeding or grazing mix where animals are getting some or most of their nutrition from pasture, particularly in the summer, and hay or other feeds are supplemented as needed, if pasture productivity is lower or, during the winter months. Another thing to think about is your goals in terms of animal performance and also forage or pasture performance. So are you trying to increase your animal numbers and increase the carrying capacity of your pasture? Are you trying to increase the availability or the productivity of the forage in your pasture? Maybe you're looking to do some renovations, have an improved pasture stand, have more forage persistence over time. Maybe on the animal side, you're looking to improve animal performance by offering them a higher quality forage source through this improved pasture. Maybe you're looking to pasture as a way to reduce feed costs, purchasing less hay and other supplemental feeds. And then finally, you could also be looking at some of the other benefits, such as things like minimizing soil erosion, mitigating soil compaction issues, increasing the water holding capacity of the soil, all of those different things. And you may not just have, one or a couple goals. Your goals may be included in all of these. But it's important to think about these when we're looking at setting up a system, so we know kind of in our minds where we are currently and where we would like to be moving forward. Along with goals, we need to think about what our resources that we have available to us are. So I've kind of broken the resources up into two different categories. This first shows several fixed resources. So fixed resource would be something like, the amount of land or space that you have on your farm. I realize, in certain cases you can have an option to purchase additional land, but in general, you're given a set amount of acreage, a set amount of space, and you have to work with what you have within that. Along with land comes things like soil type and slope or topography. You really can't change the type of soil that's on your farm, and you really can't change the slope or the topography of that landscape without some drastic measures like excavating or etc. So those are really fixed resources. Things like trees, wood lines, hedges, streams or creeks, those are all relatively fixed resources that we have to work around when we're setting up our pasture systems. Existing buildings or fencing should be taken into consideration. We want to make our system work within what is there, whether that's a barn, a handling system, existing permanent fencing, etc. And then, of course, water. We'll talk a lot about water, later in this presentation, but we need to have a source of water for our livestock. And if there are any kind of buried water lines or frost-free water hydrants, are, fixed resources that we have to work with. When it comes to our variable or our flexible resources, those would be things that are, more easily movable, portable, changeable, etc. So that would include things like above ground water lines, hoses, water troughs that we can move to different places, temporary fencing. We'll talk about some different fencing options. The stocking rate of our livestock and the number of livestock that we have on our property is flexible. And of course, our forages or the vegetation that we choose to grow. So these are all things to consider and kind of make an inventory of as we're thinking about putting all these different components together into one larger system. So the reason we want to make this kind of inventory or this list, at least in our head, is we want to work within what our existing resources are or within what our permanent resources are. We know that when it comes to grazing and pastures, there are many different shapes and forms that this can be accomplished. And flexibility can be a really big key factor in this. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all system that's going to work for every single farm. So one of the things that I like to encourage people to do is look at the big picture, think about your goals, and try not to overthink it. Keep it simple. You'll see that as a common theme throughout this presentation. So one of the first things to think about also is how we want to manage our pastures. There are management options that range from very simple, minimal labor, up to more intensive or more labor intensive systems. And here's kind of an example of what I mean by that. The most simple management system is, of course, a continuous grazing system where our livestock are turned out into one large field and they have access to that entire field area. We can move from that into a little bit more of a rotational grazing system, maybe a simple rotational grazing system where we subdivide that large pasture or field into, say, for example, 4 different areas, and we rotate the animals through those different areas. We can take this a step further, make it a little bit more intensive by subdividing each of those areas even further and doing a little bit more, being a little bit more intensive with our rotating the animals more frequently through smaller paddock sizes. And really what it comes down to is under a continuous grazing system, the livestock or the animals are going to go around that field and select what they like. Some of the good plants or the most preferable forages will disappear, and there will be a lot more of the lower digestibility stems that are left. The animals will start to avoid those areas, go back and repeatedly graze the areas that they prefer or that they like. And this kind of lowers our overall forage utilization within that field. So they've done, research looking at how much forage is utilized under these different systems. And under a continuous system, the best estimate is that there's roughly 30 to 40% of the forage in that field that's actually utilized by those animals. If we move into a rotational system, we're basically controlling the time that those animals are spending in any given area. And this is allowing for pasture, water, and soil recovery in those other areas where the animals are not currently located. So this automatically increases the forage utilization because we're, relatively speaking, we're kind of forcing those livestock into those different areas where they may not where they may not have preferred or have gone as much on their own, and therefore increasing the utilization. So if we compare continuous to rotational, we can bump that utilization up to 50 to 70% utilization, depending on our different management and our level of intensiveness. Other things that are, of course, benefits of rotational grazing include things like using those livestock to spread their own manure and urine back on different areas of the field for a more even nutrient distribution, increasing the overall productivity of that field, the persistence and longevity of that forage stand over time. All of these things are really why we kind of would want to stay away from a continuous grazing system and move into some sort of rotational grazing. I understand that not everybody is going to be really intensive about it, and not everybody should be really intensive about it. But it's important to think about that. So for the rest of this presentation, we're really going to focus on managing a pasture and a forage system under those rotational grazing systems, whether that's a little bit simpler or a little bit more intensive. Regardless, we're going to focus kind of on that rotational grazing aspect. So one of the first questions that everybody asks is, what size or how big should I make my paddocks? Well, this will depend a little bit on those different management types. If you have a larger paddock, you're going to be rotating those animals less frequently through those different areas. If you have a smaller paddock size and they're in a smaller area, those animals are going to need to be rotated more frequently through that area. In a perfect world, I would say that we really want livestock to go no more than 3 days in one area or in one paddock. And this is because after that 3-day period, those forages that were grazed on day 1 are starting to regrow and put out new growth or new vegetative shoots. And we really don't want those animals to go back and bite a plant that has started to regrow. So in a perfect world, we would be rotating them roughly every 3 or 4 days. Again, I realize that this depends on the farm and is not for everybody. So any type of rotation that we can do will automatically be an improvement or an increase over our continuous systems. When it comes to sizing, we need to know a couple of different factors. A, how often we're going to be rotating, which corresponds with B, how much forage our animals are going to be consuming. This, of course, will depend on the different types of livestock that we have, the size or body weight of those animals, the number of animals. But we know, we have averages for all of our different species and their average dry matter intake. Of course, this will depend slightly on, their life stage and their demands. A lactating dairy cow is going to be eating a lot higher percent of her body weight than a dry cow is. A hardworking horse is going to be consuming a higher percent body weight than your backyard pasture pony. But in general, we know roughly the dry matter intake of these different classes of livestock, so we can actually do a little bit of calculations and figure out on average how much our livestock will need to consume for their forage intake. So for an example, if we have a flock of 20 sheep and those sheep are all around 150 pounds and with a dry matter intake of 3% of their body weight, if we calculate that out, we need roughly 4.5 pounds per day per sheep of forage of dry matter material. So if we have 20 sheep, we multiply those 4.5 pounds by 20 sheep to give us a total of 90 pounds per day of forage to meet the intake of our flock of sheep. On the flip side of things, we need to know how much forage is available in our pasture or in our field. We know that of course, like everything, this is variable, and it will depend on the type of forage that we have growing in our field, the productivity, the weather conditions, the time of year, etc. And we know that forages, are growing and accumulating additional forage every day. So this can be a little bit hard to calculate or to measure. There are a few different strategies that we can use when it comes to measuring available forage. Things like going out and clipping a given area and actually weighing that material and calculating our amount of forage that's present, using some tools like a grazing stick or a pasture stick. These will use different measurements like the height of the forage stand, the density of that forage stand, and involve a couple of calculations that allow you to calculate how much forage is available. But on average, I would say that a rough rule of thumb is that we get roughly 300 pounds of dry matter of forage per acre per inch of forage height. So for each additional inch that forage grows in height, we get an additional 300 pounds of dry matter per acre. This is obviously a rough average. As I've said, this will vary depending on a lot of different factors, but use it as kind of a place to start. So if we use this with our example, our flock of 20 sheep, we had calculated that the flock would need 90 pounds per day. If we want a paddock that is of an appropriate size for 3 days worth of grazing, we're going to take that 90 pounds per day times 3 days, and that gives us a total of 270 pounds of dry matter needed for those sheep for that 3-day grazing period. If we use that 300 pounds of dry matter per inch rough estimate, we would need 1 acre of 1-inch tall pasture. However, you realize we're probably not going to be grazing. We shouldn't be grazing a pasture that's only 1 inch tall. So if we take, some different heights into consideration, if our pasture is 8 inches tall and we're going to graze that down to a 4-inch height, so we're going to basically turn the animals into that field when the forage is 8 inches tall, remove the animals from that field when they've grazed down to 4 inches. That gives us a total of 4 inches of grazable forage or grazable material. So 4 inches and 300 pounds of dry matter per inch gives us a total of 1,200 pounds of dry matter per acre for that field. And so to get our 270 pounds, we would need roughly a quarter of an acre for this flock of sheep at this point in time. So you can see how, these are obviously rough calculations, but it will give you a good idea of a place to start. If you know how many animals and their intake, and you know how long you want them to be in that field, you can kind of calculate roughly how much of an area they'll need. And then, of course, as you're doing this and as you're, putting these into practice, so to speak, you'll be able to realize, different adjustments. If one part of your field is a little less productive, maybe they need a little bit extra room on that side. If one area of the field is really productive and has a lot of good forage growth, and then maybe they need a little bit less space on that part. So again, flexibility is key. We want to keep our systems flexible so that we're able to accommodate different changes. But this is a good way to think of a place to start. I did also want to mention that, we know our forage production will fluctuate throughout the year. You'll see here, the typical growth curves for our cool season and our warm season forages, with those cool season grasses having a lot of production in that spring and early summer, kind of going through the summer slump in the heat of the summer, and then having more production again in the fall. So this will also impact, the amount of forage that's available in those fields and how much is available for our livestock to graze. So this will play a role on how many animals a given area can support and for how long. 2 ways that we can adjust to accommodate for that would be to adjust the sizing accordingly. When we know there's a lot of forage available, give them a slightly smaller area. When we know that there's not as much forage available, it's the heat of the summer, things aren't growing very quickly, give them a larger area. The other option is to move our animals faster or slower to accommodate that. We can leave them in a given area for a full week when it's spring and there's lots of forage available, and we might have to move them through those fields a lot faster when there's not as much forage available. So there's different ways to adjust and take these different factors into consideration. So that brings us to layout. Which layout is going to work for our farm? Well, you may have seen figures like this before. There are lots of different layouts and options and ways to set up pasture systems with all different configurations. We're going to talk about some different layouts and some different considerations when we're thinking about what would be a good layout maybe for your farm. But one thing I did want to mention is that, these figures that you see are always set up in really nice, even squares or lines, right? Or pie shapes. Well, in actuality, a lot of our farms might look a little bit more like this, right? We have things that we need to work around. We have buildings, we have groves of trees, we have driveways, we have ponds or, manure piles or manure pits. There's a lot of different things that we need to take into consideration when it comes to making a pasture layout. So one of the first things that I like to do, and I suggest that everybody does, is to sketch out a plan. We have tools like Google Earth that make it really easy to get an aerial snapshot of our farm and our fields, and we can, draw out a plan like the image that you see there. Look at, what the infrastructure is that's in place, what fields or fences or pastures can go where, how we might be able to divide those fields up in a system that makes sense. So here is a few different paddock layout options that range from a little bit more of a simpler layout to a much more intensive layout. And we're going to use these layouts as examples when we talk about the different considerations for laying out a field or a pasture. This first one is a little bit more of a simple rotation. We have 5 paddocks in this field. There's a central dry lot in the middle and a laneway system that kind of leads out to the pastures from that dry lot. If we move up a step, we have maybe a little bit more of a moderate rotation. This one has 26 different paddocks, and there is still a laneway to the barn. The laneway doesn't reach all of the different fields. We'll talk about the pros and cons to that when we talk about laneways and ease of movement. And then, we have something that's really complicated like this, where we have, 51 different paddocks, and it's a much more intensive rotation. And, we may not have any laneways, so we really need to think about the movement of animals and how we're going to get animals from one side of the farm to the other side. So we're going to be using those kind of as examples when we talk about some different considerations for paddock layouts. So here are the things we're going to cover for layout. We'll talk about barn, shelter, and handling facilities, ease of movement and laneways for moving animals around, alternative feeding areas or dry lots, access to shade, and access to water for livestock. So first, if we talk about or look at our barn or shelter or handling facilities, it is important to make sure that you have a way to get your animals back to the shelter or to the handling facilities. This is, important for obviously if we have really adverse weather conditions where we need livestock to be in out of the field and a little more protected from the weather. It's also really important for some different health considerations. We may have some sort of health or disease problem that we want to treat on a given animal, and we need to be able to get that animal or the group of animals back to our shelter or our barn or our handling facilities so that we can appropriately treat that animal as needed. So because of this, in an ideal situation, our barn or our handling facility will be in a really centralized location. However, this is one of those more permanent or more fixed resources. So there are ways to work with what you have and figure out the placement of different things. Along with that comes the ease of movement or laneways. So laneways basically just allow for us to easily move animals either back to the barn or the feeding area or from field to field. If we have water in one central location, which we'll talk about in a little bit, these laneways become essential or necessary so that the animals can get to and from that water source. One of the downsides of laneways is they take up extra space that's not, incorporated into the pastures. Oftentimes laneways become a little bit more heavily traveled, so there's not really any forage growing in those laneways. They may get muddy or tore up a little bit, and they do require a little bit more fencing to construct. One of the really important considerations for laneways and movement of animals in general is we really need these to be wide enough to get equipment through them. So think about, if you're going to be coming in with a mower or a manure spreader or a sprayer or any of those things, we really need those laneways to be maneuverable enough so that we can get equipment through those without, running into fence lines. And then laneways can be temporary or permanent fencing. We'll talk about fencing options in a little while. So here's just a couple examples. This is a laneway. You can see it goes right down the middle of the field. There are pastures going out from either side of the laneway and also at the end of the laneway. And so it's really easy for this farm to move animals up and down the lane and into different fields to and from their barn or their handling facility. You can see also the traffic or the hoof damage to that laneway. So we don't have a lot of vegetation or forage growing there. Those areas are become kind of more of a heavy use area over time as they're more traveled on. Here's another example of the laneway. The last one was maybe a little bit more temporary fencing. This one is with a little bit more of a permanent fencing system. It's a little bit wider. So again, think about the equipment that you're going to be wanting to move up and down the laneway and in and out of those gates as well. So for a farm like this example, the laneway, of course, is, the barn or the handling facility is located here on this picture. And here we have our laneway going to and from our different fields. And they simply have gates located from each of those pastures into the laneway. So this is kind of more of that centralized location system. Where all of the resources, like the shelter and the water, are centrally located, and we have a laneway leading in and out of the fields. So really all we'd have to do is open the gate to one pasture and close the gate to another pasture, and we're able to easily move animals to and from those different fields. In a system like this one, where we have no real laneways, there's a couple of things to think about when it comes to moving animals around. The first is, here is the barn or the handling facility on this farm. And if we have animals, way over here in this paddock, and we need to bring them into the barn, to give some medication or vaccinate them, weigh them, treat an animal, etc., it's going to be a little bit more complicated to get those animals back to the handling facility. We'll have to be a little bit strategic with our maneuvering. The other thing to think about with a setup like this is the movement between pastures or between fields. So if we have livestock in a field all the way on the right side, and our next field that's ready to be grazed is all the way in the upper left corner, it's going to be really complicated to get those livestock from one field to another. So you can see, based on the way that this field has been numbered, that's kind of the general route that they follow with the livestock on this field. So there's kind of a flow of livestock from pasture to pasture, paddock to paddock, that kind of follows in nice order. So it's easy for them to move animals from field to field in that way. Here is that same farm without all the stencils or the drawings. I just wanted to show you if you were to put a laneway or a couple of laneways on this farm, what you might consider. Maybe something like this. That gives you a couple of laneways that can get your animals to and from pretty much every field, at least every major field on this farm. And if you wanted laneways or you wanted an easier time to move animals around, those might be some good options of a location for where you could put those in. That brings us to alternative feeding areas, or oftentimes these are referred to as a dry lot or a sacrifice lot. Basically, this is a place to feed our livestock when we do have those adverse weather conditions over the winter, when our pasture isn't growing, if we don't have stockpiled forages that we're feeding and we need to feed hay, if our pastures become really sloppy, too wet or muddy to graze, if we need to get the animals off the fields because the pastures need rest, or we're doing some renovation, or spraying, fertilizing, etc. Any of those times, it's really nice to have some sort of feeding area where we can contain our livestock and keep them off of the field. It doesn't have to be a dry lot or a sacrifice lot. It could also be just one of our paddocks that we've designated kind of as a sacrifice paddock. And we know that this area is probably going to get a little bit more beat up and have a lot more hoof traffic on it. And we may need to be doing some renovation to that pasture down the line. One other thing that I just briefly wanted to mention, we're not going to go into it a lot today, but these dry lots or sacrifice lots do tend to get pretty muddy and tore up. So one option is installing some better footing with something like a high traffic pad, which I'll show a picture of in a second. But here is kind of, some examples of those alternative feeding areas, dry lots. You can see that they're using these as a source of shelter, a source of water, a place to feed hay or grain, supplemental feeds, etc. And usually these are somehow connected to those pasture systems. Here is some pictures of the installation of what a high traffic pad might look like. Basically, we're digging up the top, 8 inches or so of the soil and laying down several different layers of what's basically kind of a landscaping fabric and different layers of rock or gravel. And what we end up getting is an area like what you see in this bottom right picture, where you can see they installed a high traffic pad down the laneway and also in the first maybe 20 feet or so of that dry lot field. So it gives those horses a nice dry place to stand, especially when the weather is wet and things are relatively muddy. So that's just something to think about if you're having a lot of mud issues or looking into that. They can be a little bit more expensive to put in, but it can, if you're planning on using that as more of a permanent feeding area, they can be an option. So in this example with our more simple system, the dry lot or the feeding area is right here. You can see again, we have those gates leading out to those different fields, which makes it very easy to move animals in and out. In this one, this farm has a couple of alternative feeding areas. They have one in the barnyard, and then they also have another one with a water source and a small dry lot kind of up on the hill. This farm, if they were to think about maybe incorporating another one, you could put one smaller area up on the other hill, kind of give you kind of an even distribution of these different feeding areas across the farm. All right, so that brings us to access to shade. We know that every single paddock in a system might not need shade, but ideally each of our kind of larger fields or kind of general areas has some sort of access to shade. Of course, the first thing we think about when it comes to shade is something like trees or wooded edges, but there's lots of different shade options. We have 3-sided shelters, shelters that have just a roof with no sides, shade cloth. We can get creative. Here are some different pictures showing some examples of ways that we can incorporate shade in our fields. So you can see the top two are not necessarily a permanent structure, but a little bit more immobile. You could easily enough though, put those on some skis and pull them behind, a 4-wheeler or something possibly to kind of move them around to different areas. They also have, kind of high tech or a little bit fancier mobile shade units that are on wheels that can be moved around to different areas of the field for those parts that we don't necessarily have any trees or other access to shade or resources. One advantage of a system like this when it comes to shade is because we have this central dry lot system, we can have, you know, a three-sided shelter or some sort of roof shelter for shade in that dry lot. And because those animals have access to that dry lot area all the time, they can come and go as they please. So they can come into the dry lot, you know, have the shade and water, etc. there, and go back out into the field as they would like to. So we don't necessarily need to have shade in every single one of our pastures or our fields. In a system like this farm, you know, there's not that central dry lot or that central system with a shade option for all of the species. However, what this farm does is utilizes those tree lines or those edges as shade. So you can see almost every field of the big fields on this farm has some sort of tree line where they can kind of strategically maneuver the animals to be up against those trees if they're in need of shade or if the weather is hot and dry. Really, the only areas of the farm that don't have good access to shade would be this field in the middle here and this field down on the kind of middle over there. So in that type of situation, what you need to do is just be a little bit more careful or strategic with your management. You know, kind of try to plan your timing so the animals aren't in those particular fields during the hottest or driest times of the year, or you know, maybe open up a fence and let them have access to that field, but also allow them to go back to another field that does have shade, so they can go back and stand in the shade if they need to, especially, you know, a week like this one where it's really hot and humid outside. Access to water can actually be one of the most limiting factors in a grazing system, especially a rotational system. We really can think about water as two different types of water systems. We have some portable or more temporary options that are really designed more for the summer or you know, the grazing months when the weather's above freezing. And then we have some more fixed or permanent options that can be used year-round. The key with water is we want to be strategic and try to make one water source serve several different paddocks. This will require, you know, fewer hydrants or tanks or sources of water, and also, you know, if we're using some hosing or tubing to get water to different places, requires fewer connections, fewer valves, etc. So when it comes to summer watering options, of course, these need to stem from or come from some sort of well or permanent source. Oftentimes they will consist of some sort of above ground piping or hose. You know, you can get UV resistant PVC, an inch or an inch and a half is, you know, a common size. You can use a garden hose, anything that will kind of transport that water from the permanent source out to our different fields or different areas. There's also kind of the more manual type, which are refilled, you know, as needed, or you know, daily or weekly, however, depending on your tank size. But those need to be, you know, kind of manually turned on and off to fill up the tanks, or we can implement some sort of automatic valve where that will automatically replenish the water tank as it becomes depleted. So, you know, tanks like this usually require kind of a manual refill, whether that's from a water hydrant directly, via hose, etc. And then we have automatic valves, which I did get a video of, just because it's easier to show maybe than to explain. So here's the water tank. You can see the valve inside. They have it connected to a hose, which runs along the fence line. So that's where the water source is coming from. That hose that's along the ground there is coming from their permanent water source, their well or their frost-free water pump. And they have those hoses strategically placed around the field in different areas. And all they have to do is use the quick connect system, plug that in, and then that provides water using the valve to that water trough. So the water will start filling, and you know, when the tank is full, the water will shut off. As the cattle drink, the water starts filling again. So that's just an option of one way that you might go about setting up kind of more of a summer watering option, but one that's more of a temporary system. You can see this place has, this is actually the farm that we've been looking at the overview of with all of the different pastures. So they use a lot of temporary fencing, temporary gates. They do a lot of movement throughout those fields. I just thought that that was a nice video to show you a good option of the summer watering system. One other thing to consider is, the video showed that piping running above the ground. This is a different farm that has that same sort of piping and valve system, but they have it below ground. The advantage to this, other than maybe looking a little bit cleaner or neater by not having that piping running along the surface of the ground, is that you'll probably be able to use a system like this a little bit longer in the year, because if with those pipes below ground, they're getting a little bit of insulation, so they won't freeze quite as quickly or as much as the ones that are running above ground. But still, really a summer watering option that you're not going to be able to use during really cold times or when it's frozen out. In the winter, winter watering is really more of a permanent setup because we need those water lines to be buried below the frost line, and we need to use a frost-free trough or watering device. So for these, we really kind of want, again, that central location that can serve multiple different fields. We can have a few, out in our fields in different areas, or we can have one major water source that's located in that barn or feeding area. Here's an example of what a more of a winter or permanent watering system might look like. And here again in this picture, they have their water source. You can see the blue dot in a dry lot there. That indicates where the access to water is. So they don't have to worry, in this case, about providing water out to each of those different fields. Versus this case, which is the farm that we saw the video, they have 3 sources of permanent water on the farm, but then they use those pipes and tubing and valves to go out to all of those different pastures as the animals are moving around the farm. One thing I did want to mention for access to water is, you try to get as many pastures to one watering source as you can, but there is a limit to that. When you use some of these kind of pie-shaped configurations, if you have, a really narrow area leading up to a water source, you have to think about how many livestock you have, and if, the livestock may be pushing each other or bullying each other to get to the water. But also this usually ends up with an area of those pastures kind of around that water source that's really heavily utilized because those animals are staying kind of close to that water source, and then areas further away from the water source where the fields are being underutilized. So, it's easier to construct in this case because you have less water sources, but you do kind of shift that utilization to be a little bit heavier near the water source and lighter away from the water source. So that's just something to consider when we're thinking about different systems and how we're going to set up our water sources. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about is some different fencing options. We have, as you're probably aware, many options for fencing. Some are permanent. We want, of course, for a permanent fence, something that's going to be really sturdy and durable. These are usually more secure, more of a long-term investment. And then we have temporary fencing, which really is best used for interior fencing. It's portable, it's easy to move, it offers a lot of flexibility. Usually for these temporary fencing, they require electricity, and we usually draw power from our exterior permanent fencing or from, some sort of solar powered panel or battery powered panel. If we look at some of the different fencing options, I'm not going to go over every fencing option because that probably could be a whole webinar in itself, looking at all the different fencing types and options. But just to give you an idea of some of the major or more common ones, we have board fences, which you've all probably seen before. These can be made out of wood or PVC plastic, and they're kind of the more traditional board fence look that you might see. We also have high tensile wire fences. These are, I think, becoming increasingly popular because they're a little bit less expensive, and they still provide a really good boundary or perimeter fence. You can see that these can be used for all different classes of livestock. We'll show a slide on some of the different spacing between the wires or the lines in a minute. But these are another option for a good permanent fence. And we also have the option to put electricity through the wires on this fencing option. Another option for a permanent fencing type would be something like a woven wire fence. You can have these with or without the board on top. So you see the option on the top right does not have that wooden board across the top. The one on the bottom does. That's kind of, personal preference, more of a look or aesthetic type of thing. Another fencing option that's sort of a in between permanent and temporary would be something like a T-post with a wire or woven wire. T-posts are relatively easy to move around, a little bit more cumbersome than some of our really temporary options, but they can be moved. So this is kind of a semi-permanent option that we can use as a permanent fence. It's also still relatively portable if we do decide that we want to change and move it elsewhere. And then we have, several different temporary fencing options. Electric netting comes in a lot of different sizes. It's very portable. It works well for a variety of species. It can be a little bit awkward to handle or move. We used this a lot when I was a graduate student with the horses. That top left picture is at the University of Minnesota with our horse research herd. And we used this electric netting quite a bit for the horses, and it worked very well. The one key thing is you really need to maintain that electric charge to that fence. Otherwise, the animals don't respect it quite as well, and they find it very easy to push it over. And they do tend to get a little bit tangled. So that's one downside of the electric netting. Another really common temporary fencing option is something like a polywire or tape, which is really easy to handle and maneuver. You just have a reel, you walk out across the pasture, you put in either some step-in posts or some T-posts. So it can also be, again, a very maneuverable fence. But again, we need to keep this hot. So you can see in that bottom right picture, they have a gate or a connector that's going from that reel, that temporary fence, and it will be hooked over to the main fence line, the electric fence line. You can also hook that reel of that temporary fence, if you have the metal connector, right onto the high tensile wire fence to provide that electric charge to that temporary fence. And you really need the electric charge, especially for the polywire options, because that tiny wire, that tiny piece of tape is really not going to do much if the animals don't respect it from the electricity. When it comes to fencing, there are a lot of different options for both total fence height and also spacing between the different wires. So that's something else to consider, depending on what type of livestock you have and what age or life status of those livestock are going to be, and how high or tightly spaced you want to make those wires. This figure just has kind of a good overall guideline. For something like cattle or horses, one of those larger animals, you may only need 3 or 4 wires. But for something like sheep or goats, you're going to need more wires, and you're going to need them a little bit more closer together. You also need to think about opening size. We don't want our animals to get their head stuck in the fence and not be able to go back through, especially something like a goat that has horns. That's not a good situation if they can fit their head through, but they can't fit it back out. That's only going to cause problems and headaches. So we need to either make those openings a little bit smaller so they can't get their head through, or much larger so that they can easily stick their head in and out. So opening size and spacing is an important consideration when it comes to fencing. So I kind of went over a lot today, but I wanted to highlight a few things to remember. One is to work with your existing or permanent resources. So, have a secure perimeter fence so you aren't worried about those livestock escaping or getting out onto the road or in other dangerous situations. But keep the interior of that fence flexible. You may think you're going to want to put your fence in one spot, and 6 months later, you're going to want to move it somewhere else. So at least initially, it's really helpful to keep that interior fencing a little bit more flexible, because you will find that you'll change your mind on how you want to work things as you get more and more into it. When you think about, of course, access to water, shade, movement of those animals across different topographies, different lands, to their different resources, those are all important considerations. Again, grazing comes in many shapes and forms, so there's not going to be a one size fits all. Keep things flexible and figure out what works best for your farm. What works best for you might not necessarily be what works best for your neighbors down the road. And lastly, I always suggest with starting small and keeping it simple. So if you're looking to get into rotational grazing and starting to do, a little bit more pasture management, take one large field and divide that field into 2 to 4 sections. Just string a wire or put up an electric netting down the middle and start flipping the animals from side to side. That's already going to be a big improvement over, one large continuously grazed field. And it will give you a way to kind of get your feet wet, get used to the different equipment and technology, and figure out what works best for you. So with that is everything that I had for today. I haven't really been looking at the chat, but I can check that now, and I would be happy to take questions. I did put my email on there. If anyone doesn't get their question answered or comes up with more questions later on, feel free to shoot me a message.
I have a few on here. I'm not sure if you can see, Amanda. One question, wondering about paddock organization and recommendations suitable for goats.
I don't see. Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Well, it says she's wondering if this paddock organization and recommendations is also suitable for goats. I'm not sure which paddock organization.
Okay, yeah. When it comes to goats, really any of the setups or ways that you're going to lay out your pasture can be suitable for goats. The biggest consideration for goats is going to be making your fencing secure enough that they can't get in, around, or underneath it, get their head stuck in it. So you don't want an opening size where the goat can get their head in through the fence but not back out. You're going to need your, if you're using like a high tensile wire fence, you're going to want, those wires to be a little bit closer together so goats can go through or underneath them. Actually, Susan Shanian, the small ruminant specialist, her office is right down the hall from me, and she always says that, it's a very common misconception that everyone thinks goats are going to jump up and out and over fencing, but actually they're more like snakes, and they kind of go underneath or through or in between things. So if you have goats, be thinking about those kinds of things and looking for possible escape routes. But when it comes to a layout, goats can be rotated through different pastures, just like any of our other livestock species can.
Okay. Then I have a quick question on here. I think it was sent just to me. The name of the system with the float. That someone wants to know the name of that watering system.
Oh, I think I see that question too. Amy, are you referring to the one of the video? Yes. That is, I believe, some sort of Job valve or something along those lines. I'd have to look up the exact name, but you should just be able to look up something along the lines of like automatic water shut off or automatic water valve for livestock, something like that, and something similar should come up. If you can't find it, let me know and I can help.
Then there's a few questions down in the Q&A section. Read them out.
Oh yes, I see them. Does the type of livestock matter? We have sheep and horses. So yeah, again, this is kind of similar to the goat question. You can make a pasture system and a rotational grazing system work for all types of livestock. The extra considerations will be, for the sheep, they're obviously a lot smaller, so you're going to want to set up your fencing appropriately for them. Horses maybe a little bit bigger and pushier, so you're going to want to make sure you have a good sturdy perimeter fence. Things sheep like to rub on fence. If they get itchy, horses might too. So you want to make sure that your fence can is sturdy enough to withstand a little bit of the pressure, or have that electricity there, so that kind of prevents them from rubbing on it. I hope that answered your question. If not, shoot us a follow-up. In terms of the recommended 3 days in one field, I see it's not a quick or easy answer. That is definitely not a quick or easy answer. That's just kind of a general recommendation from a forage standpoint. If you really want to optimize the regrowth of your forage, having those livestock come back and nip off the top of a plant after it's just started to regrow is a lot harder on that plant than moving the livestock off onto a different area of the field to plants that haven't been grazed yet. So I realize that it's not always easy and not always doable. That's why that's kind of the ideal situation. But even moving them once a week or every 10 days and providing that pasture that was grazed with enough rest to properly regrow, and maintain its carbohydrate reserves and put out adequate leaf material again. That's really the key. The biggest thing with all of these rotational grazing systems, are allowing our forages enough rest so that they can regrow and not be continuously grazed over and over again.
Okay.
Oh, I see that person said that they had to hop off.
Yeah.
Let's do the recording.
Yes. That's good. I think that's all I see as far as questions. Well, I want to thank you, Amanda. That was very good information. I think it looks like everybody else thought so as well. So I guess, do we have everything? Okay.
Yeah, that
Well,
looks like everything to me. So thanks everybody for joining us.
thank you. Everyone have a good day.